All right. Awesome. Okay, finally we are live. All right, everybody. So I realized that, and thank you so much for joining me, and welcome to this YouTube Live. I've been experimenting with the live platforms, and I tried to pre-book one, and it didn't work out, and I'm thinking it's because I made it an unlisted live session. So this time I made this a listed live session, and I'll continue streaming with that. But in the meantime, thank you so much for joining me. My name is Anna Sabramowitz, and I help people plan, write, and draft fabulous e-learning scenarios. And the reason I do that is because there's a lot of people who have amazing knowledge inside their heads. They have amazing experiences. There's not enough of those to go around, and it's in most companies' benefit to capture those experiences and actually turn them into contextual, useful scenarios to augment the rest of the training that they're launching for their employees. So it's actually a win-win. You get to capture all this awesome stuff and awesome context, which everybody loves because it tells them, why the heck am I supposed to be participating in this training? And then the other thing that it does is it helps you augment whatever training you already have. And a lot of companies have tons and tons of training already. Whatever training you already have, now you can add these little snippets of awesome context to that training and not need to replace the actual training piece, which is one of the things I advocate, is that you don't actually necessarily need to really change and reskin or do all those other things to your current training. What you can actually do is create a couple of really punchy, powerful scenarios to give people context as to why that training is useful. And boom, you've got it. Because one of the things you have to think about is the people who have come before you, who are like the rock stars, they trained someplace. They took some kind of training, and it was probably, very much in line with whatever training you already have in place, right? So it's not that you necessarily need to revamp all the training material so they work on mobile, so they look cooler, so the font is easier to read. No, you don't need to do much of that. You need to change the context. And my prime example for this, and I know you're going to think it's kind of silly, but this is YouTube, is that once in a while I'll get people telling me that they need, when they're designing their learning, they need to have like high production, and like the fact that the idea of actually bringing out a phone and doing learning while you're, let's say you're watching somebody do something and having them like talk about what they're doing, what they're thinking while they're doing it, capturing that info. To them, that's like, no, that's too gross. We need to have, high production value. But then I tell them, okay, so as far as I'm concerned, the only thing that people really pay attention to when it comes to these kinds of experiences online, especially in video, is if I can hear the person. If I can't, then obviously half of it is gone. Maybe closed captioning helps. But if you realize that, let's say something's broken at your house, like the flushing mechanism on your toilet. When you search for the YouTube video, let's say, to show you how to fix it, which is what I do all the time. I'm an impromptu, just-in-time fix-it person. Then what happens is I will look for the video that has the most views and the most likes. So those are my two factors, right? It has nothing to do with the quality of the video. Like if the video is a guy with like a shaky cam and he's like showing me stuff, but it's exactly what I need in that moment and the description matches the context that I want, I don't care how poo-poo it is. I really will just watch that whole video. So that's what's awesome, is that you're training resources that have already satisfied a lot of somebody's needs. All you need to do to make them more relevant to your new audience is not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, is to actually add context and help people perceive the gaps that they don't know that they have, that this training will help them augment or fill, or the mentorship opportunities that they now should seek out because they thought they were better at something and it didn't work out exactly the way they wanted it to. So, and when I say they, I mean learners, and it didn't work out the way it wanted it to, as in they were presented in a situation, which is a scenario, and they were given certain choices on how to manage it. And then once they chose one, they get a consequence of what the repercussions or the outcome of that specific decision is, right? And a lot of times, it's not what we expected. If it's done right and it's at the target at the right audience, an audience who has not had the aha moment yet, this is perfect. This is exactly what you need. So, and then what happens is, like with my, example of the toilet mechanism, the minute the gap is perceived, I am now hungry to find exactly the kind of information that will fill that gap. And I am not picky about the way it looks, as long as I can hear and see the directions. I notice nothing else. I don't care about anything else because that info is now super contextual to me and I want it. So that's one of the things that we want to do, create with our scenarios, is create this thirst and need and drive to access all the other materials. So one of the other things that we have to do is, when we're designing our scenarios, is just make sure that when that light bulb goes off in somebody's face or somebody's mind, maybe in their face, that what you are then supplying them with is the relevant resources for them to take the next step. So here's the book, or here's a mentoring group, or here's a coach that you should get in touch with. Here's a stream, a pathway in the learning management system. So that's kind of how it should kind of play out. Okay, so I have some specific questions that were sent in, and if you're just joining me, hello and welcome. Thanks so much. So one of the questions that came out that I thought was really good, and I'm going to post it in the chat. And apparently when you post things in the chat, I just learned this, there is a limit of 200 characters. So I'm going to post it here. Okay, cool. All right, so here's the first question. How do you balance between developing a scenario that is robust enough to legitimately represent a realistic example without making it so complex that it takes too long or it takes too many resources to build? Which I think it's an awesome question, because I just had a conversation with somebody who's not in this world. Like, they're the person who are basically benefiting from this scenario project. They're kind of like the sponsor, but they know the jobs and the detail of the subject matter expert that we're going to be interviewing for the scenarios, but they know all the details of that job. So when I said we're going to build a scenario, they thought, okay, well, that's going to take some time, because there's, step 1, 2, all the way to 50 for this person to be able to share what it takes to do this job well. And that's actually super common for people to assume that we have to, when we're designing scenarios, we have to basically take somebody from, as my friend Fawn would say, from soup to nuts, to actually have them understand, the inner workings of that scenario. But we don't. That's what the beauty of this is. There's not necessarily any rules around scenarios. So I'm going to break any ones that people feel are there. So when you have a scenario, and this is done really well using storytelling, is what you can do is, when you're working with a subject matter expert, you don't want to overwhelm somebody by who's going to be on the receiving end of that scenario with like 100 decisions, because that's not, it's not fair to them. So one of the things you can do is, when you're working with a subject matter expert, definitely capture the A to Z of how, let's say, a leader does something, or how an expert does something. But one of the pieces that you're also kind of pulling out with either the sponsor or also the procedure expert that you might get access to is, what are those key decisions that, and the question is, if you do this one thing, what's the one thing that makes the other pieces irrelevant or less important? So it's almost like, what are those like keystone behaviors that if somebody does this, how does it make the other things not as important or make them almost disappear? So let's say, for an example, if you're talking about somebody who is, let's say in retail, and you're trying to teach somebody customer service when a person comes into the store. Well, maybe the most important thing for that person to get comfortable with is to ask open-ended questions. And if they just get comfortable with that one skill, and we have them practice doing that for like 10 scenarios, then all the other stuff about, recommending the right shoe or following up with, here's other things is like, those other things are almost going to fall into the background, because that one skill set is almost like the success metric, right? If you do this, then a lot of the things will actually fall into place already. So when you're designing your scenarios, let's say you're doing a leadership one and there's like 20 different things that a leader needs to do to be a successful leader. But we can't teach somebody that or help them come to that realization, because it would just be like, that project would be ginormous, right? So what you can do is then with your subject matter expert, work through, let's say, that path and say, okay, if one of these is taken out, will everything else crumble? Okay, so this sounds like a keystone habit. Okay, let's talk about that. Let's talk about this behavior. And then what you can do is bring up and build up to that part of the story, have this narrative, like John came into the office and this happened and he observed this and he did this and this was great. And then you pose a decision point. That's the critical, that's tied to that critical step, that critical habit or aha that most people need to have, or behavior or mindset, whatever it is. And then have them make a decision based on that. And then what's great is once they see the consequence, you can actually either leave it as such and then direct them to more learning, if that's enough, or you can just create 3 or 4 more similar situations that help somebody practice that specific skill set. And I suggest this is done, because then then each scenario is kind of tied around a specific competency. And you know that at least at the end of that, there's somebody who's making decisions or has a perspective that's tied to that, that's way more focused than if you tried to acknowledge all of it. And also what's great is that if you use the scenario to prompt somebody to discover that they have a gap in this specific skill set, then the recommendations that you offer for them to actually participate in, let's say, training or pick up a specific book, or reach out to Susan because she's going to hook you up with a mentor. That's going to be way more targeted and way more focused and have so much more context, right? Because you're like, oh, okay, they're not just blanket offering me this orientation to leadership. I now know that this is going to specifically help me upskill in this area, and that's going to be totally valuable. So that's what I say to that. I say keep it down to, and then there's nothing stopping you from saying, okay, this is skill number 2. Let's build a second scenario option with 3 or 4 questions there that are just dedicated to that. But I'd say keep it focused on those like single decisions from the very beginning, because the other thing is you lose momentum when things are just so huge and when you can't chunk them. And also it's very hard to get subject matter experts who are, the reason they're experts and the reason they're top performers is because they're actually doing that stuff in the real world. So to get people who are the elite, to get them to commit to working out like 50 scenario options with you is probably going to be impossible. So I say start small and choose. And what happens too is now you can get very, very laser focused on the kinds of experts you source based on the skill set. So that's also an advantage. So I say go for that, because then also the first scenario that you develop will be an awesome test to see what's resonating with your audience. Is it having an impact? Are you marketing this stuff enough to actually for people to see it, and then get some feedback, iterate, and then create something, second, awesome, beautiful. All right. Hope that was helpful. If you have any questions about that specific answer that I provided, please post it in the chat. Okay. And then I had this other awesome question, which is, okay, here we go. Let me just copy and paste it into here so that you guys can see it. Cool. All right. So when designing for a diverse audience, how do you look for opening situations that will resonate with everyone? And this is kind of interesting because the diverse audience is a challenge because it depends on the kind of diverse you're talking about. It could be, that's a great question, by the way. Let me just take a little sip of my coffee. So yummy. Okay. So one of the things that we can do when we're talking about diverse audiences is think about how are they diverse. If it's a role-based diversity, like we're trying to launch learning for the customer service rep, their supervisor, and the department head. Now, if you're trying to squeeze learning for all those people inside the same scenario, one, you probably want to avoid that because there's different considerations. However, what you could do, and when I see different considerations, I mean sometimes the perspective or the language even or the goal of a person would change from scenario to scenario. So it's actually way better for you to create fewer scenarios with a more targeted audience versus lots of scenarios that have a broad reach, because then you're diluting it and diluting the message and probably trying to, it's not that you necessarily do that on purpose with scenarios. But what happens is because we're always trying to, like, let's say I'm having a conversation right now and I'm trying to reach people, like 500 people, and I have no idea, I was just broadcasting on a random channel. I'd have no idea if any of you were interested in scenarios, right? So then what I would be doing is I would be trying to talk about things that everybody could understand, which is not possible. So I'm only talking about specialized language in a specialized context with a specialized tool, which is e-learning scenarios, right? So, then what I suggest is segment your audiences, because realistically, if there is some commonalities between your scenarios, as far as these are all about decision making, then you definitely can do that. You can definitely take that and recycle it almost, and then change the role and the context a little bit if the consequences don't change. But if your consequences are varied, I wouldn't advise that. Although there is another way to approach this, and you could say, if I'm shooting, or if I'm designing e-learning for people who are the customer service rep, the supervisor, and the manager, and then what I need to do is potentially let's say maybe part of my training is that you consider making decisions on behalf of those other people, and the reality and the context will be different based on who you choose to be. So that would actually be pretty awesome, because it might it might show or help you develop empathy for the different roles, because there's usually a bunch of, and this is just from personal experience, the people who are at the customer service level feel like they're being neglected by the people at the manager level, or that they don't understand each other, or that the decisions that are making are not validated with reality. So, and that happens all the way from the manager level as well down to the customer service rep, who has a limited scope of, access and is face to face with a customer. So those are different dynamics, different responsibilities, and also different priorities, right? So that would actually work very well. And then the other thing I suggest is, if you cannot get away from the fact that your audience is different, but you are trying to teach the same skill set and the consequences will be the same, then the way to get them to mesh together in an awesome union of awesomeness is to incorporate a story that those people will resonate with. So one of the things that usually happens is that people say, okay, how can I make this general enough so that everybody will be able to relate to it? And that is the equivalent of putting out a one-size t-shirt and saying, hey, I've made you all a t-shirt. Now, there will be some people who will fit that t-shirt and who will think that that's a great t-shirt. However, that will be a very small percentage of people. And also the love that those people will have for that t-shirt will probably be like, yeah, it's nothing special. It's a one size fits all t-shirt. However, if you say, look, there's this person and they bought themselves this t-shirt, and it's covered in diamonds and rhinestones, and it's got these wings on the back. And this person goes to the store with this t-shirt on, and these are the things that start happening. So I totally mixed up the t-shirt analogies there. But the idea is that the more custom you make something, the more custom a story you make, it's not necessarily how custom that story is how awesome that character is, how relatable that person is. And then what happens is we're no longer trying to be catering to everybody by putting them in the first person point of view, like, sharpshooter, and you're walking through places and shooting people and it's you doing that, because there's no connection to that, because that's not you. But if you can represent somebody who's going through a challenge and your learners can empathize with that person, then you can actually have a more quote unquote general scenario, which is not actually more general. You're reaching wider audiences, but you have a specific story now that they're following, and the choices are not your participants' choices. The choices and the consequences that result are from the perspective of that character, which is actually more powerful, because it's easier for us to see the flaws in other people's, it's easier to give advice than to take it, right? So, and also it's easier to observe behavior and notice what's wrong with it versus actually looking at ourselves and saying, oh, I don't think I did that. So what you're trying to do is actually give somebody that breakthrough by observing somebody else's story and making that person as human and as original as possible. You're trying to make them, they don't have a general face and a general name, and you actually want to make them very specific, because that's what we remember, that's what we relate to, and that's what makes it seem more real, because everything else makes it seem generic, which we don't care about, right? It just disappears. So I hope that helps. And yeah, I think for today, that's enough of those questions. I think they were very good questions, by the way. Hope you agree. And if you have any of your own, please post them under the video and I will work to address them. I am planning to do these very often this week, maybe the next one, maybe tomorrow. Watch out for it if I figure out how to schedule these properly. But otherwise, I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day, and I will talk to you next time, my friends. Take care. Bye.